My son hacked into the school system and the superintendent made him IT director. The call came at 9:42 on a Wednesday morning while I was restocking inventory at the hardware store where I worked. My manager's voice cut through my phone. "Eleanor, you need to go. School emergency. They said it's urgent." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my keys and ran to my car with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My son Caleb was 14, quiet, spent most of his time on his computer in his bedroom. He'd never been in trouble, never skipped class, never talked back to teachers. The worst thing he'd ever done was forget to take out the trash. I drove to Lincoln High School, breaking every speed limit and trying not to imagine what kind of emergency would require pulling a parent out of work in the middle of a Wednesday morning. The parking lot had 3 police cars and an unmarked sedan with government plates. My stomach dropped as I pulled into a spot with shaking hands. I walked through the front entrance on legs that felt disconnected from my body. The receptionist looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Pity, mixed with something else. Maybe fear. She directed me to the superintendent's conference room on the 3rd floor without making eye contact. I took the stairs because waiting for the elevator felt impossible. The conference room had a long table surrounded by people I didn't recognize. Superintendent Graves sat at the head looking grim. Next to him was a woman in a dark suit with FBI credentials clipped to her belt. 2 police officers stood by the windows. A man in an expensive suit that screamed lawyer sat reviewing documents. And at the far end of the table was Caleb. My 14-year-old son looked small and pale in a chair that seemed designed to swallow him. His eyes met mine, and I saw terror there. I moved toward him automatically, but Superintendent Graves stood and gestured to the chair next to my son. "Mrs. Thornton, thank you for coming so quickly. We have a serious situation that requires your immediate attention." His voice was formal and cold. I sat down next to Caleb and took his hand under the table. It was ice cold and trembling. I asked what was happening and why my son was surrounded by law enforcement. The FBI agent introduced herself as Special Agent Reeves and explained in a measured tone that Caleb had been caught hacking into the school district's computer system. She said he'd gained unauthorized access to administrative databases, student records, financial systems, and confidential employee information. She added that federal computer fraud laws made this a serious crime that could result in juvenile detention and permanent damage to his future. The words hit me in waves. Hacking, unauthorized access, federal crime, juvenile detention. I looked at Caleb, and he was staring at the table with tears rolling down his face. I asked him if this was true, and he nodded without looking up. Superintendent Graves took over the conversation and explained that the breach had been discovered that morning when the IT department noticed unusual activity on the network. They'd traced it back to Caleb's student login credentials and found evidence of extensive unauthorized access over the past 3 weeks. He said the district took cybersecurity very seriously and that this kind of violation couldn't be tolerated. The lawyer whose name I never caught started talking about liability and legal exposure and the need to make an example. I felt panic rising in my chest because this couldn't be happening. Caleb was a good kid. He helped elderly neighbors with their computers. He tutored other students in math. He'd never shown any interest in breaking rules or causing trouble. I asked why he would do something this reckless, and Caleb finally looked up at me with red eyes and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I found something, Mom. Something really bad." The room went quiet. Special Agent Reeves leaned forward and asked Caleb to explain what he meant. Caleb's voice shook as he started talking. He said he'd been trying to check his own grades 3 weeks ago through the student portal when he'd noticed something strange. The page had loaded incorrectly and shown him part of the back-end code. He'd seen a command sequence that didn't make sense for a normal grade viewing function. Being curious and good with computers, he'd investigated further. What he'd found was a sophisticated script running in the background of the grade management system. The script was automatically changing grades for certain students. Not randomly, but systematically targeting specific student IDs. Caleb said he'd initially thought it was a glitch, but when he dug deeper, he'd realized it was intentional. Someone with administrative access had installed it deliberately. He'd spent the next 3 weeks carefully documenting everything he found, mapping which students were affected, tracking when the changes happened, trying to figure out who had created the script and why. He said he'd planned to report it to someone, but he didn't know who to trust because whoever did this had to be someone with high-level access to the system. Superintendent Graves's face had gone from stern to pale. He asked Caleb to clarify what he was claiming. Caleb pulled out a folder from his backpack with shaking hands. Inside were printouts of code, spreadsheets showing grade changes, and a USB drive. He explained that the script was lowering grades for students from low-income families while inflating grades for students whose parents donated to the school foundation. He had documentation showing 43 students whose GPAs had been artificially manipulated over the past 2 years. The changes were small enough to avoid detection. A B+ changed to a B, an A- changed to a B+. But over time, the cumulative effect was devastating. Students who should have qualified for Honor Society were excluded. Scholarship opportunities were missed. College applications were weaker than they should have been, and it was all targeted at students whose families couldn't afford to donate thousands of dollars to the school foundation. Special Agent Reeves took the folder and started reviewing the documents with an expression that shifted from skepticism to shock. She asked Caleb how he'd confirmed the pattern, and he explained his methodology. He'd cross-referenced the affected student IDs with the school's donation records, which he'd accessed through the administrative system. Every single student whose grades were being lowered came from families who'd never donated. Every student whose grades were being raised had parents on the foundation's donor list. The lawyer stopped taking notes and looked at Superintendent Graves with an expression I couldn't quite read. Superintendent Graves was staring at the documents Special Agent Reeves had laid out on the table. His face had gone from pale to gray. One of the police officers moved closer to look at the evidence. Special Agent Reeves asked who had administrative access to install and maintain this kind of script in the district's system. Superintendent Graves said quietly that only 3 people had that level of access: himself, the Assistant Superintendent for Academics, Dr. Philip Carver, and the IT Director, Dennis Yang. Special Agent Reeves asked where Dr. Carver was at that moment. Superintendent Graves said he was in a budget meeting with the school board. He pulled out his phone and made a call telling whoever answered to detain Dr. Carver immediately and not let him access any computers. Then he called security and had them lock down the IT department. The room erupted into organized chaos as people started making calls and issuing instructions. I sat there holding Caleb's hand while federal agents and police officers transformed what had started as my son's prosecution into a major investigation. Special Agent Reeves spent 20 minutes questioning Caleb about his methodology and the evidence he'd collected. She seemed impressed, despite herself, by how thorough he'd been. She asked if he'd made copies of anything or altered any data. Caleb said he'd been careful not to change anything. He'd only documented what was already there. He'd made encrypted backups of everything on the USB drive and stored additional copies in secure cloud storage in case something happened to the originals. She asked where he'd learned to do this kind of forensic investigation, and he said honestly that he'd taught himself from online tutorials and hacking forums. He'd wanted to make sure his evidence would hold up in court if it ever got that far. She told him that what he'd done was technically illegal, but that given the circumstances and his motives, there wouldn't be charges filed against him. She added that his documentation was better than what most adults would have produced. Superintendent Graves looked like he wanted to vomit. He kept checking his phone and making quiet calls. I heard him say phrases like fiduciary breach and criminal fraud and notify the board immediately. Dr. Carver was brought to the conference room 30 minutes later by 2 police officers. He was in his late 50s, well-dressed, with the kind of polished confidence that came from decades in administration. He looked annoyed rather than concerned when he walked in. He asked what this was about and why he'd been pulled out of an important board meeting. Special Agent Reeves introduced herself and asked him to sit down. She laid out the evidence on the table and asked if he recognized the code. Dr. Carver's expression shifted rapidly from annoyance to confusion to something that might have been fear. He said he didn't know what she was talking about. She showed him the logs proving the script had been installed using his administrative credentials. She showed him the pattern of grade changes targeting low-income students while benefiting donor families. She asked him to explain how his credentials had been used to systematically manipulate student grades over a 2-year period. Dr. Carver started talking about security breaches and stolen passwords, and someone must have hacked his account. Special Agent Reeves pointed out that the script had been modified 15 times over 2 years, always from computers in his office, always during his logged-in sessions. She said the digital forensics made it clear this wasn't a hack. This was deliberate and sustained fraud. Dr. Carver's polished confidence cracked. He started demanding to speak with his lawyer. He said this was a misunderstanding and he wouldn't answer questions without legal representation. One of the police officers read him his rights while Special Agent Reeves continued laying out evidence. She showed emails between Dr. Carver and wealthy donors where he'd apparently promised that their children's academic records would receive appropriate attention. She showed financial records indicating Dr. Carver had received unreported gifts from foundation donors, expensive dinners, golf club memberships, a new car from a donor who owned a dealership. Everything was documented in the files Caleb had pulled from the system. Dr. Carver stopped talking entirely and sat with his arms crossed, staring at the wall. Superintendent Graves looked devastated. He said he'd trusted Dr. Carver for 12 years. They'd worked together to build the district's reputation. He'd had no idea this was happening. Special Agent Reeves said they'd need to verify that, but right now, the evidence pointed to Dr. Carver acting alone. The police officers escorted Dr. Carver out of the room. He didn't look at any of us as he left. The room felt different after Dr. Carver was gone. The tension shifted from my son being in trouble to everyone trying to figure out how to handle what he'd exposed. Superintendent Graves ran his hands through his hair and said this was going to destroy the district's reputation. The lawyer started talking about damage control and public relations. Special Agent Reeves said there would need to be a full forensic audit of every grade change over the past 5 years. She said the affected students would need to be identified and their records corrected. She added that this would likely trigger civil lawsuits from families whose children had lost scholarships or college opportunities because of artificially lowered grades. I listened to them talk and realized they were treating this like a PR problem instead of the moral catastrophe it actually was. I interrupted and asked how many students' lives had been derailed by this. How many kids from families like mine had lost opportunities because some administrator decided wealthy donors deserved better treatment. The room went quiet. Superintendent Graves looked at me and said he understood my anger, but they needed to handle this carefully. I stood up and said they should be grateful my son had the skills and courage to expose this before more damage was done. I pointed out that Caleb could have sold this information or used it for personal gain, but instead, he'd carefully documented everything to make sure the students being hurt would get justice. Superintendent Graves nodded slowly. He looked at Caleb and said he was right. He said what Caleb had done took remarkable technical skill and even more remarkable moral courage. He said most adults wouldn't have had the integrity to handle it the way Caleb had. He asked Caleb how he'd learned to do such sophisticated forensic investigation. Caleb explained quietly that he'd been teaching himself programming and cybersecurity for years. He'd taken online courses and earned several certification credentials. He'd actually been planning to major in computer science in college. Superintendent Graves asked if Caleb understood how the district's IT infrastructure worked. Caleb said he'd learned the architecture while investigating the grade manipulation. He could map the entire network now. He understood the security vulnerabilities and where the system could be strengthened. He'd found 3 other potential security issues while he was documenting the grade fraud. Superintendent Graves made a decision in that moment that I saw cross his face. He asked his assistant to contact the school board president and arrange an emergency meeting for that evening. He told Special Agent Reeves he wanted to cooperate fully with the investigation. He asked Caleb if he would be willing to work with the FBI and the district's forensic auditors to identify all affected students and help restore correct grades. Caleb nodded. Superintendent Graves thanked him and said the district owed him an enormous debt. Then he said something that made my jaw drop. He said the district's IT director, Dennis Yang, had already submitted his resignation that morning for personal reasons. The position was vacant. He said given what he'd seen of Caleb's skills and judgment, he'd like to offer him the position on a consulting basis until he graduated and could take it full-time. He said Caleb clearly understood the system better than anyone currently on staff. He said the district needed someone with integrity who couldn't be bought or intimidated, someone who would put students first. He looked at me and asked if I would consent to Caleb taking on this responsibility. I sat there stunned, trying to process what had just happened. My son had gone from facing federal charges to being offered a job as IT director of a school district that served 15,000 students. Superintendent Graves said it was unusual, but these were unusual circumstances. He said Caleb would work under the supervision of the assistant superintendent for operations until he turned 18. He'd be paid a consultant rate of $45 per hour for 20 hours per week during the school year. The role would include overseeing the security audit, implementing new safeguards, and training staff on cybersecurity protocols. He said Caleb could work remotely most of the time so it wouldn't interfere with his education. In fact, he'd arranged for Caleb to get high school credit for the work as an advanced independent study in computer science. Special Agent Reeves said the FBI would need Caleb's cooperation during their investigation, and this arrangement would actually make that easier. She added off the record that she'd worked with teenage hackers before, and most of them were either criminals or got recruited by criminal organizations. Having someone with Caleb's skills working on the right side was valuable. She said if he kept developing these abilities, he should consider applying to the FBI's cybersecurity division after college. I looked at Caleb and asked if this was what he wanted. He nodded slowly. He said he wanted to make sure what happened to those students got fixed. He wanted to make sure it couldn't happen again. I told Superintendent Graves we'd agree to the arrangement on the condition that Caleb's identity as the person who exposed the fraud would be protected. I didn't want him targeted by families of students who'd been benefiting from the inflated grades or by anyone connected to Dr. Carver. Superintendent Graves agreed immediately. He said the official story would be that an anonymous security audit had uncovered irregularities. Caleb's role would be described as a consultant brought in to strengthen the system after vulnerabilities were discovered. Only the people in this room would know the full truth. The lawyer started drawing up paperwork. Special Agent Reeves took detailed statements from everyone. The police officers left to coordinate with the district attorney's office about charges against Dr. Carver. And I sat there next to my son trying to comprehend how a morning that started with panic and fear had turned into something completely different. The emergency school board meeting that evening was tense. I sat in the back with Caleb while Superintendent Graves presented what had been discovered. He explained that a security consultant had uncovered evidence of systematic grade manipulation affecting dozens of students over multiple years. He said Dr. Carver had been arrested on fraud charges and the FBI was investigating. He said the district would be conducting a comprehensive forensic audit to identify every affected student and restore accurate records. Several board members looked shocked. One woman asked how this could have gone undetected for so long. Superintendent Graves admitted that the district's cybersecurity protocols had been inadequate. He said they were bringing in a consultant to overhaul the entire system and implement proper safeguards. The board president asked about the consultant's qualifications. Superintendent Graves said the consultant had already demonstrated exceptional skill in digital forensics and had credentials in cybersecurity. He said the consultant would work under close supervision and that given the sensitive nature of the work he was requesting, the board approved the hiring without the standard public posting. The vote was unanimous. The next 3 months were a whirlwind. Caleb spent every evening and weekend working with FBI forensic accountants and the district's legal team. He'd come home from school and immediately go to his computer pulling data, cross-referencing records, mapping the extent of Dr. Carver's manipulation. He identified 89 students whose grades had been artificially lowered over 5 years. Some had lost scholarship opportunities. Some had been denied admission to honor society. Some had been cut from advanced placement courses because their GPAs appeared too low to handle the rigor. Caleb also identified 47 students whose grades had been artificially inflated, children of major donors who'd been given advantages they hadn't earned. The legal implications were staggering. The district's insurance company got involved. Lawyers started reaching out to affected families. Several families filed lawsuits. The local news picked up the story and ran headlines about grade manipulation and pay-to-play schemes. Dr. Carver's face was on the news every night. His lawyer was trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence Caleb had compiled was so thorough there wasn't much room for negotiation. Caleb worked with the district to implement new security protocols. He redesigned the grade management system to include multiple layers of verification. He set up automated alerts for unusual access patterns. He created detailed audit logs that tracked every change to student records with timestamps and user IDs. He trained the staff on cybersecurity basics and created a system where any grade change required dual authentication from a teacher and an administrator. He found and patched 7 other security vulnerabilities in the district's network that could have been exploited. Superintendent Graves told me, privately, that Caleb had probably prevented future breaches that could have been even worse. He said the district's system was now more secure than most university networks. I watched my 14-year-old son transform into someone I barely recognized. He'd always been quiet and shy. Now he was leading meetings with adults twice his age. He was explaining technical concepts to board members and lawyers. He was making decisions that affected thousands of students. He was handling responsibility that would crush most adults. The media attention was intense. Reporters wanted to know who had discovered the fraud. Superintendent Graves stuck to the agreed story about an anonymous security audit. But rumors started circulating. Other students knew Caleb was good with computers. Some people put pieces together. By the end of the school year, Caleb's classmates knew he'd had something to do with exposing Dr. Carver. The response was mixed. Some students treated him like a hero. Students whose grades had been artificially lowered thanked him for getting their records corrected. One girl named Keisha, whose scholarship had been restored because her real GPA was discovered, told Caleb he'd changed her life. She'd thought she wasn't smart enough for the honors program, but it turned out her grades had been deliberately suppressed because her family couldn't afford to donate. Other students were hostile. Kids whose parents were wealthy donors, whose inflated grades had been corrected, blamed Caleb for ruining their transcripts. One boy, whose father was a major foundation donor, confronted Caleb in the cafeteria, calling him a snitch and a narc. The situation got tense before a teacher intervened. I worried about Caleb constantly. He was carrying adult responsibilities while still being a kid. He barely slept. He stopped hanging out with friends. He ate meals at his computer while reviewing security logs. I talked to him about balance and taking breaks and being a normal teenager. He told me he couldn't stop now. Too many students were depending on him to get their records fixed. Too many families were waiting for justice. He said he'd rest after it was done. I contacted a therapist who specialized in gifted children and arranged sessions to help Caleb process everything. The therapist, Dr. Monica Sterling, said Caleb was experiencing what she called moral injury. He'd seen injustice and couldn't unsee it. He felt responsible for fixing it even though the situation wasn't his fault. She said this was common in children with high moral sensitivity who encountered systemic problems. She worked with him on setting boundaries and recognizing that he couldn't fix everything alone. It helped some. Caleb started sleeping a bit more. He agreed to take weekends off from consulting work, but I could see the experience had changed him permanently. The criminal trial for Dr. Carver happened 8 months after his arrest. Caleb had to testify about how he'd discovered the fraud and the methodology he'd used to document it. The defense attorney tried to discredit him by emphasizing his age and his illegal access to the system. The prosecutor countered by pointing out that Caleb's investigation had been more thorough than most professional forensic audits. Expert witnesses confirmed that his documentation was technically sound and legally admissible. The jury took 6 hours to convict Dr. Carver on all counts. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to affected families. The judge made a statement during sentencing about the profound betrayal of public trust. He said educators had a duty to treat all students fairly regardless of their families' financial circumstances. He said Dr. Carver had violated that duty in the most calculated and cruel way possible. He mentioned that a young person with integrity had been forced to expose this fraud because the adults in charge had failed their responsibility. He didn't name Caleb, but everyone in the courtroom knew who he meant. The civil lawsuits took longer to resolve. The district's insurance eventually settled with most families. Students who'd lost scholarships received financial compensation. Students who'd been denied opportunities received formal apologies and support for appeals to colleges that had rejected them. The district implemented new oversight policies. The school board created a position for an independent auditor to review all administrative actions quarterly. They established a whistleblower hotline for students and staff to report concerns anonymously. They partnered with a university to provide ongoing cybersecurity monitoring. Superintendent Graves credited Caleb's work with not only exposing the fraud, but providing a roadmap for preventing future abuses. The district used Caleb's security protocols as a model that other school districts across the state started adopting. He became a consultant for multiple districts, helping them strengthen their systems. By the time Caleb was 16, he was earning more money than I made at the hardware store. He'd saved enough to help with household expenses and start a college fund. He told me he wanted to study computer science and law. He wanted to work in digital forensics, exposing corruption and helping organizations protect themselves from fraud. The story got picked up by national education publications. Articles were written about the youngest IT director in the country and the teenager who'd exposed a $1 million fraud scheme. Caleb gave several interviews, always focusing on the affected students rather than himself. He talked about how technology could be used to hurt vulnerable people, but also could be used to protect them and expose injustice. He talked about the responsibility that came with technical skills. He said anyone who understood systems and had access to information had a moral duty to use that knowledge ethically. Universities started reaching out. MIT invited him to speak at a cybersecurity conference. Stanford offered him early admission to their computer science program. The FBI's cybersecurity division reached out about summer internship programs for high school students. Special Agent Reeves told me privately that Caleb had a brilliant future in law enforcement or private security if he wanted it. She said people with his combination of technical skill and moral clarity were rare. She said most hackers were either criminals or mercenaries. Caleb was something different. I watched my son grow into someone I was enormously proud of and also worried about constantly. He'd seen too much too young. He'd been forced to navigate adult corruption and institutional failure at 14. He'd made enemies among powerful families whose children had lost their unfair advantages. He received threats online from people who blamed him for exposing the fraud. We had to change our home security and monitor social media for harassment. The school assigned a liaison to watch for bullying or retaliation. Caleb handled it with a maturity that shouldn't have been necessary for a teenager. He told me once, late at night, when he couldn't sleep, that he didn't regret what he'd done. He said those 89 students deserved to have their records corrected. He said Keisha deserved her scholarship. He said the kids whose families couldn't afford thousands in donations deserved the same opportunities as everyone else. He said if exposing that truth made some people angry, then those weren't people whose approval mattered. I held him and told him I was proud of him. I said he'd shown more courage and integrity than most adults ever managed. Dr. Sterling continued working with Caleb through high school, helping him process the experience and develop healthy coping strategies. She connected him with other gifted students who'd faced similar moral dilemmas. She helped him understand that his sensitivity to injustice was a strength, not a weakness, but that he needed to protect himself too. She taught him to recognize when a problem was his to solve versus when he needed to pass it to adults or authorities. She helped him develop boundaries so he wouldn't burn out trying to fix every problem he encountered. The work made a difference. Caleb started engaging more with his peers. He joined the robotics club and the coding competition team. He went to prom in his junior year. He applied to colleges with essays about technology and justice and using skills to protect vulnerable people. He got into every school he applied to. He chose MIT because of their strong programs in both computer science and digital forensics. He wanted to learn how to build better systems that couldn't be exploited by people like Dr. Carver. The summer before Caleb left for college, Superintendent Graves held a private dinner to thank him for his work. The school board president attended along with several administrators and Special Agent Reeves who'd driven up from the FBI field office. They presented Caleb with a formal resolution thanking him for his service to the district and recognizing his exceptional contributions to student welfare and institutional integrity. Superintendent Graves gave a speech about how one person's moral courage could change entire systems. He said Caleb had exposed a fraud that affected hundreds of students across multiple years. He said the security protocols Caleb developed were now being used by 40 school districts statewide, protecting over 200,000 students. He said Caleb's work had led to policy changes at the state level, requiring independent audits of grade management systems. He said one teenager with a conscience and a laptop had done more to protect students than years of administrative oversight. Caleb thanked everyone and said he just wanted to make sure students got treated fairly. He said the credit belonged to the students like Keisha, who'd been hurt by the system and deserved justice. His humility made everyone in the room emotional. 4 years later, Caleb graduated from MIT with degrees in computer science and criminal justice. He'd spent summers interning with the FBI's cyber division, working on cases involving financial fraud and institutional corruption. He'd helped expose embezzlement schemes in 3 different school districts and 2 municipal governments. He developed forensic tools that other investigators were using. He had job offers from tech companies, law enforcement agencies, and private security firms. He chose to work for a nonprofit organization that provided free digital forensic services to underfunded school districts and community organizations. He said he wanted to protect the kinds of students who'd been hurt by Dr. Carver. Students whose families couldn't afford expensive consultants or lawyers. Students who needed someone with technical skills and moral clarity fighting for them. I attended his first day at the new job and watched him explain to a group of teachers how to recognize signs of grade manipulation in their district system. He was 22 and commanding the respect of educators twice his age. I thought about that terrified 14-year-old sitting in a conference room surrounded by law enforcement. I thought about how close he'd come to being prosecuted for the same hacking that had exposed institutional fraud. I thought about Superintendent Graves making the decision to recognize Caleb's skills instead of punishing them. The organization Caleb worked for grew rapidly. They exposed corruption in a dozen school districts in the first 3 years. They recovered millions in stolen funds. They helped hundreds of students get their records corrected and their opportunities restored. Caleb became the director of investigations at 25. He hired other young technologists with similar skills and moral commitments. He built a team that could take on systemic fraud wherever they found it. He testified before state legislatures about cybersecurity, requirements for public institutions. He wrote papers about ethical hacking and whistleblower protections. He spoke at conferences about using technology for justice. And every single case he worked on, he thought about those 89 students whose grades had been lowered because their families couldn't donate. He thought about Keisha and her restored scholarship. He thought about the responsibility that came with understanding how systems worked and having the skills to expose when they were being abused. He told me once that everything he did now traced back to that moment when he was 14 and discovered that someone was hurting students deliberately and systematically. He said finding that fraud had shown him what he was meant to do with his life. Years later, when Caleb was being interviewed for a documentary about whistleblowers and institutional reform, the interviewer asked what advice he'd give young people who discovered wrongdoing. Caleb thought for a moment and said, "Document everything meticulously. Seek advice from people you trust, and remember that exposing injustice often means making powerful people angry, but that doesn't make it wrong." He said the students who'd been hurt by Dr. Carver's scheme deserved someone willing to take the risk of speaking up. He said integrity meant doing the right thing, even when it was scary, and even when it might cost you something. He said his mother had taught him that fairness mattered more than convenience. The interviewer turned to me and asked what it was like watching my teenage son take on a school district and win. I said honestly that I'd been terrified every step of the way. I said Caleb could have faced federal charges and permanent criminal records, but I said I was also proud beyond words that he'd seen injustice and couldn't walk away from it. I said he'd shown me what real courage looked like. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.